412. That was the number Delaney Cross kept in her private notebook after 7 years of night shifts in the St. Bridget's emergency room. 412 times she had held someone on this side of the line. Not once had anyone ever held on to her. She was 28, had never let anyone close enough to know which side she slept on, and she had learned that the safest way to live was to owe nobody anything. That Tuesday night, they wheeled in a man with no papers, no wallet, no name. The doctor on duty said wait. Delaney didn't wait. She argued, and she won him 12 minutes. 12 minutes, as it turned out, was the whole difference between living and dying. In his one moment of consciousness, that man caught her wrist and asked her name. She pulled her hand away. By morning, the bed was empty. Nobody had signed a discharge form, and she wrote 3 words in her notebook. John Doe number 4. It should have ended there. He should have vanished from her life the way everyone else always had. Then 3 weeks later, in a dark apartment on Beacon Hill, a shadow stepped out of the shadows and said her name. And Delaney Cross understood that the man she had saved that night was the most dangerous man in Boston. If Delaney and Enzo's story reached you tonight, leave a like so we know you're still listening. Share it with someone you think needs to hear this one too. And subscribe with the notification bell on, so you never miss the next story we've saved just for you. 3 weeks passed, and Delaney didn't think about that man anymore. At least, that was what she told herself. Night shift followed night shift, Tuesday slipping into Wednesday, Friday into Saturday, until the days of the week lost all meaning and only 2 kinds of time remained: time spent in the emergency room and time spent catching up on sleep. She took extra shifts. She always took extra shifts. On the kitchen table in her basement apartment in South Boston sat a stack of unopened white envelopes, each one stamped with bold lettering in the upper left corner, each one thicker than the last. Delaney knew what they said. She didn't need to open them to know that the number was still exactly where it had always been. $94,000, a number that had followed her for 7 years and would keep following her for how much longer. She didn't dare calculate. She simply pushed the stack aside whenever she needed room for her coffee cup. At 4 o'clock in the morning, she caught the first bus of the day, sat in the 3rd row on the left, rested her forehead against the cold window, and drifted off for exactly 17 minutes, until the bus crossed the bridge. The driver knew her face. He never asked her anything. He only gave her one nod when she got on, and another when she stepped off. And for Delaney, that was enough. On Friday night, Miriam Pruitt set a cardboard box on the nurse's station and lifted the lid without saying a word. The scent of cinnamon pastries rose through the smell of antiseptic. Miriam was 62 years old and had been the head nurse at St. Bridget's since before Delaney knew how to hold a stethoscope, and she had a way all her own of making people obey her. She didn't ask. She simply pushed the box toward Delaney and stood there with her arms folded. "Eat, child. You're as thin as a clothes hanger," Miriam said. "I already ate." "You're lying. I've watched you for 7 years, Delaney Cross. I know when you've eaten and when you haven't." Delaney picked up a pastry. She ate the whole thing slowly, and Miriam stood watching until she finished before turning away and going back to her work. It was the only thing in Delaney's life that she didn't have to repay. She slipped the notebook into the pocket of her coat, the blue-covered notebook with its corners worn soft, the one no one in the hospital was allowed to open. Inside were names, numbers, the nights she won, and the nights she lost. There was one name she had written on the first page, and never written again. Wesley, her little brother, 12 years old that year, the boy who drew dinosaurs on the covers of every notebook he owned, even his math notebook, even his sister's notebooks. He drew more herbivores than carnivores, because he said the plant eaters were gentler. He laughed so loudly that the neighbors would knock on the wall. One summer afternoon, the 2 of them sat on the front steps of their house, and Wesley rested his chin in his hands, studied his sister for a long time, then said, "Lainey, when you grow up, wear white, all right? You'd look so beautiful in white." Delaney had laughed and told him she would. She hadn't known what she was promising. She only knew that 7 years later, she was still keeping that promise, night after night, beneath the fluorescent lights of an emergency room in South Boston. On Tuesday morning, as Delaney passed the reception desk to return a chart, the receptionist looked up and spoke casually. "Miss Cross, someone came by yesterday asking about your work schedule." Delaney stopped. "Who was it?" "I don't know." "A man in a dark coat. He asked for your schedule this month. He asked which exit you usually use when your shift ends." I told him the hospital doesn't provide employee information. He thanked me and left. Did he leave a name? No. Delaney nodded, picked up the chart, and kept walking. In her mind, the matter was filed away with 100 other small, forgettable incidents that happened in a public hospital. A patient's relative wandering into the wrong place, a reporter fishing for information, someone looking for the wrong department. She worked in an emergency room in South Boston. Strangers were part of every day. She didn't give it another second of thought. And later, whenever she remembered that morning, what sent a chill down her spine wasn't the man's questions, but the fact that she herself had walked past them so easily. That evening, just as she slipped off her shoes inside the apartment door, her phone vibrated in her pocket. A message from Sloan. "Lainey, help. I'm going to Providence for 2 days, and all my plants are about to die. Can you go water them for me and pick up my mail while you're there? The key is still in the usual place. I'll owe you for the rest of my life." Delaney stared at the screen for a long moment. Then she sighed, put her shoes back on, and headed for the door. Sloan's building stood on a slope in Beacon Hill, where the sidewalk bricks had been sinking since the last century, and no one bothered to repair them, because their unevenness was precisely what made the neighborhood worth its price. Delaney took the service elevator as she always did, pressed 7, and while she waited for the doors to open, she thought about how she would be back on shift at 7 o'clock the following evening. She retrieved the key from beneath the ceramic planter in the hallway, inserted it into the lock, and realized the door was already unlocked. She stood still for 1 second. Sloan was absent-minded. Sloan had once left her wallet in the refrigerator. Forgetting to lock the door wasn't unusual. Delaney pushed the door open, stepped inside, and reached for the switch on the left. Nothing happened. She pressed it again, up and down, twice, then 3 times. The apartment remained dark. The only light was the pale golden glow of the city spilling through the tall windows that reached the ceiling, enough for her to see the outlines of the furniture and not enough for her to see anything else. The air in the room was heavy and warm. It smelled of cedar and something faintly smoky, not cigarette smoke, but the lingering scent left behind after someone had just extinguished a match. "The breaker has been switched off," a voice said from the living room. Delaney froze in the doorway. Her heart struck once so hard that she heard it inside her ears. The voice was low, slow, and utterly without warmth. But it wasn't that coldness that chilled her. It was the fact that the words were merely an announcement, not a threat, not a warning, just someone telling her a fact, as though her standing there and his sitting in the darkness had both been arranged in advance, and she was the last person to know. Delaney's hand was still suspended over the light switch. 7 years in the emergency room had taught her that the most dangerous thing in any room was always the thing that made no sound. And she immediately did what she always did whenever everything moved beyond her control. She stood still, and she counted. A figure separated itself from the darkness of the sofa and took 2 steps forward, directly into the pale golden strip of light from the window. Delaney saw the scar before she saw the face. A thin white line crossed his left eyebrow and angled upward for about half the length of a finger joint. She had seen that scar beneath the surgical lights, from 2 handspans away, while one of her hands pressed a piece of gauze firmly in place, and she shouted at the attending physician that his blood pressure was falling and they couldn't wait any longer. She had stared at it through the longest hour of her 7 years in medicine. Then she looked up and saw the rest of him. The man standing before her was taller than she remembered, broader through the shoulders than she remembered, and he stood with the posture of someone who had never once needed to wonder whether he was permitted to be where he was. He wore a dark sweater, no tie, no ring, and nothing at all that would help anyone remember his face. Only an old watch on his left wrist, its glass scratched. He didn't take another step. He didn't touch her. He didn't say a single word that could be called threatening, and that was exactly why Delaney was more afraid than she had been during any of the times a patient's relative had grabbed her by the collar in an emergency room hallway. Those people shouted because they had nothing else left to do. This man didn't need to shout. "Give me 12 minutes, he said. Delaney couldn't answer. Her throat was so dry that she was afraid if she opened her mouth, nothing would come out but a rasp. "How much do I have to return to make it enough?" She swallowed. "You were my patient," she said, and she was surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "Patients don't owe me anything in return." The man tilted his head slightly. "You were the only person in that building who said that." "I don't care what anyone else said." "I do," he replied. "I woke up once. I asked your name. You pulled your hand away, and you didn't answer. No one has done that to me in 7 years. Delaney could hear the blood moving through her ears. She thought about the door behind her. She thought about the fact that she was standing exactly 1 step away from it. And she understood at once that if this man wanted to keep her from leaving the room, it wouldn't matter whether she stood near the door or far from it. He didn't need to block her path. He only needed to stand there. "Sloane isn't home," she said. "She asked me to come water her plants." "I know she isn't home," he replied. "She hasn't been home for 2 days." Something dropped inside Delaney's chest. 2 days. Sloane had texted her that evening, saying she was going to Providence for 2 days, with 3 smiling faces as usual. Delaney opened her mouth to say it, then stopped, because some instinct, very old and very deep, the same instinct that had kept her alive through the year she was 18, told her not to give anything to a stranger before she knew what he intended to do with it. The man watched her. He didn't ask another question. He only watched, and Delaney had the distinct and deeply unsettling feeling that he had just seen the exact moment she decided to remain silent, seen it as clearly as someone watching the hand of a clock move forward by 1 mark. She held her breath. She hadn't meant to. She simply did. And she knew he noticed, because the corner of his mouth shifted slightly, not into a smile, only a minute change in a face that never seemed to change at all. Then he reached into his pocket. Delaney stepped back half a pace before she could think, but the only thing he took out was a small metal flashlight. He pressed the switch, and a beam of white light swept across the room, then stopped on the wall behind the sofa. The wall behind the sofa, the same wall where 3 weeks earlier 2 abstract paintings Sloane had bought at an art fair had been hanging, was now completely bare. In their place were photographs, dozens of pictures printed on a household printer, pinned directly into the paint with thumbtacks and connected by a tangled web of red thread. Some had been taken secretly through car windows. Some had been shot from above, looking down on a parking lot. There were several blurred photocopies and a map of the Harbor District, with 3 places circled in red ink. Delaney stepped half a pace closer without realizing she had moved, and the beam of the flashlight shifted with her, stopping on the photograph at the very center of the web. The man standing beside her was in that photograph. He was walking down the steps of some building, his head slightly lowered, and around his face was a red circle that had been drawn over and over so many times that the pen had torn through the paper. Delaney looked at the circle, then turned toward him. He wasn't looking at the wall, he was looking at her. "Did Sloane make this?" she asked, and her voice sounded strange even to her own ears. "My niece made it," he replied. "Over the last 3 months. Your niece." Delaney repeated those words inside her mind, and felt the floor shift slightly beneath her feet. Sloane had mentioned an uncle once. Only once, a long time ago, on a night when they had both drunk a little too much and Sloane was crying because her father had just died. "My uncle controls everything now," Sloane had said, then changed the subject so quickly that Delaney never had the chance to ask another question. For the next 3 years, that name was never mentioned again. "You're Castellani," Delaney said. "Enzo Castellani," he replied. "You can sit down if you want." "I don't want to sit down." Enzo switched off the flashlight. The room sank back into the pale golden light spilling through the windows, and in the darkness his voice remained even and slow, like a man reading from an inventory list. Delaney Cross, 28 years old, registered nurse, emergency department at St. Brigid's Mercy Hospital, 7 years, almost entirely on night shifts. Your shift begins at 7 o'clock in the evening and ends at 7 o'clock in the morning, and this month you've taken 9 additional shifts beyond your schedule. You live in a basement apartment on Dorchester Street, rented since 2018, and you pay on the 1st of every month. You take the 4:10 morning bus and always sit in the 3rd row. You don't go out. You don't date. You owe $94,000 in hospital bills, a debt placed in your name when you were 21. He paused for a moment. "That debt isn't yours," he said. "It belongs to Wesley Cross." Something broke very softly inside Delaney's chest. She didn't cry. She had no intention of crying, but both her hands began to shake, and she clenched them inside the fabric of her coat to make them stop, and they kept shaking. "Don't say his name," she said. "I only said it so you'd understand that I'm not guessing. I know. Whatever you know has nothing to do with me." Delaney took 1 step forward, the first step that night she had chosen to take toward him. "You think I saved you because I wanted something? You think I stood there arguing with the attending physician so that one day you could knock on my door and ask how much money I wanted? I don't save people so they'll owe me. I save them because it's my job. There's a difference. In the 3 years since Enzo Castellani had taken his brother's chair, he had heard countless people speak to him in every possible tone, begging, bargaining, threatening, flattering. No one had ever stood 1 meter away from him in a dark room and scolded him while both hands trembled uncontrollably. He stepped back half a pace. Not because he was afraid. It was the kind of step a person took after realizing he had been standing closer than necessary. "All right," he said. "Then there is no debt between us. Good. But I still need you." A short, dry laugh escaped Delaney, without the slightest trace of amusement. "What could you possibly need from me? You have an entire city." "I have an entire city, and no one in it is someone Sloane would call," Enzo said. He pointed toward the wall behind him. "My niece spent 3 months building this. Then 2 days ago, she disappeared. Her phone is off. There have been no transactions on her bank cards. Her car is still in the garage. No one in Providence has seen her because she never went to Providence." Delaney stood motionless. The message from that evening was still in her coat pocket, with its 3 smiling faces. She had intended to remain silent. Now that silence had become too heavy for her to hold. "She texted me at 9 o'clock tonight," she said. "She asked me to come water her plants and collect her mail." Enzo didn't look surprised. He only nodded once, very slowly, and that nod unsettled Delaney more than any startled reaction would have. "Do you believe she wrote it?" he asked. Delaney couldn't answer. "If Sloane is still free," Enzo continued, "there is only one place in this entire city she would run to, and it isn't my house. Do you know why?" Delaney knew. When she was 18, her mother died, and the funeral cost $2,800 she didn't have. She had sat in the hallway of the funeral home for 3 hours, not knowing what to do. Sloane Castellani, 17 years old, had paid the entire amount with her father's credit card without asking anyone, then taken Delaney home and hidden her in the small house beside the swimming pool for 4 months, until Delaney was old enough to sign a lease on her own. Sloane had never mentioned it again. Not once, and that was precisely why Delaney had never forgotten. "I know," she said. "Then you're coming with me." Delaney looked out the window, down at the brick-paved slope, where a black car waited with its taillights still glowing. She thought about her mother. She thought about all the years she had lived carefully, counting every dollar, every step, every promise, only so she would never have to stand in exactly the place where she stood now. Then she thought about those 4 months in the little house beside the pool. Some debts couldn't be repaid with money. She walked toward the door before Enzo did. 3 minutes later, the car door closed behind her, and Delaney crossed the line she had spent 7 years watching from the other side. No one spoke during the first 15 minutes in the car. Delaney sat pressed close to the door, one hand still gripping the strap of her bag as though that cloth bag could keep her anchored to the earth, and she watched the city slide past outside the window in an order she didn't recognize. The car wasn't heading toward South Boston. It crossed the bridge, turned left, then turned left again into a district of low warehouses and container yards in Charlestown, where the streetlights stood too far apart and long stretches of darkness lay between them. The driver was a broad-shouldered man with closely cropped hair and a face marked by old scars. Enzo called him Bruno. Bruno never turned around, never asked a question, and spoke only once as the car slowed. "The lights in the warehouse are still on, sir. There are 2 cars." Enzo looked outside. The third warehouse had a sheet metal roof, one closed rolling door, and a smaller side door left slightly open, with dull yellow light spilling through it in a narrow strip across the wet concrete. He spoke without turning his head. "You go in first." Delaney jerked around to face him. "What did you say?" "If I push through that door first, the people inside will react the way they always do, and Sloane will be standing between us. If you go first, you're the only person tonight she won't be afraid of. Call her name. Let her see your face." Delaney felt her heart beating somewhere high in her throat. She thought about the thin cloth coat she was wearing, the soft-soled nursing shoes on her feet, and the fact that the only things in her pockets were a blue-covered notebook and a ring of keys. Then she thought about Sloane at 17, standing in the hallway of the funeral home, holding out her father's card without asking Delaney a single question. "All right," she said. "I'll be directly behind you," Enzo said. "If anything happens, get down. Don't run. Get down." Delaney crossed the concrete yard, and the sound of her soles striking the standing water seemed so loud that she imagined the entire district could hear it. She pushed open the side door. Inside was a vast, empty space with a high ceiling. several rows of bare metal shelving, and an industrial light hanging crookedly overhead. There were 3 people in the center of that pool of light. 2 men were standing, and 1 person sat on an overturned plastic crate. The person sitting there was Sloane. Her hair had been tied back in haste. Her fleece coat lay across her lap, and on the crate beside her were a large brown envelope and a thick stack of money bound with a rubber band. Sloane wasn't tied up. No one was holding her arms. She was counting the money. Delaney froze in the doorway. "Sloane," she called. Sloane looked up, and for a fraction of a second her face went so pale that Delaney would remember it for the rest of her life, because it wasn't the face of someone who had just been rescued. It was the face of someone who had just been caught. "Laney," Sloane gasped. "No, it isn't what you think. Go home. Go home right now." Then her eyes slid past Delaney's shoulder and stopped on the man who had just stepped inside behind her, and everything remaining in Sloane's face collapsed all at once. "Uncle," she said. The 2 men reacted faster. One stepped backward toward the metal shelves, reaching behind his back. The other lunged for the brown envelope on the plastic crate. "Get down," Enzo said, and Delaney got down. She pressed her face against the cold concrete, wrapped both hands over her head, and for the next 7 seconds, she saw nothing. She only listened. The side door slammed against the wall as Bruno came through behind them. Shoes pounded across the cement. Several sets of footsteps driving toward one side. Metal struck the shelving, and the entire row shuddered with a long, rattling sound. A plastic crate toppled over. There was one very short burst of breath. Then came the sound of a body sliding down the sheet metal wall to the floor, slow and heavy, followed by silence. Sloane screamed once, then stopped abruptly. Delaney lifted her head. One man sat slumped at the foot of the wall, both hands clutching his shoulder, his head bowed. The other lay face down while Bruno held one arm behind his back, and both men were still breathing loudly, like people who had just run as hard as they could. Enzo stood between them. He wasn't in any hurry. He bent down, picked up the brown envelope, brushed the dust from one corner with his thumb, then tucked it beneath his arm the way someone might carry a newspaper. "Who paid you?" he asked. No one answered. Enzo nodded once. "Then go back and tell the man who paid you that I have this. Tell him I know what he's selling and who he's selling it to. And tell him that if I have to come this far in the middle of the night again, I won't come alone the way I did tonight." He turned away. Bruno released the man. The 2 men struggled to their feet, helped each other toward the door, and no one followed them. Only after the sound of their engine had vanished completely at the end of the road did Enzo turn toward his niece. Sloane stood beside the plastic crate, with both arms hanging at her sides, and the stack of money still lay on the floor between them. "What were you buying?" he asked, very softly. "Don't ask me. What were you buying, Sloane?" Sloane looked up. Her eyes were red but dry. "I was buying the truth," she said. "For 3 years, I couldn't buy a single word of it from you. So I had to buy it somewhere else." No one in the warehouse moved. Delaney rose, brushed off both knees, and stood there between the person she loved and the man whose life she had saved 3 weeks earlier. And for the first time that night, she understood that she hadn't walked into a rescue at all. She had stepped into the middle of a family breaking apart. "Take her home," Enzo said to Bruno. Sloane didn't object. She passed Delaney and stopped for exactly 1 second. Long enough to whisper a single sentence without looking her friend in the eyes. "Don't trust him, Laney." Then she walked out the door. Delaney remained in the empty warehouse, her ears still ringing, and as she turned to look for her bag, the crooked industrial light swept across the place where Enzo stood. She saw it immediately, because 7 years in the emergency room had trained her eyes to find that before anything else in a room. On the left forearm of his dark sweater was a patch darker than the fabric around it, and that darkness was spreading very slowly. "Your arm is cut," Delaney said. Enzo looked down at his forearm like a man who had just been reminded that he had forgotten his umbrella. "It's nothing. I didn't ask whether you were all right. I said your arm is cut." She walked straight toward the car waiting outside on the concrete lot, opened the rear door, and before he could say another word, she climbed inside and pulled the door shut. There was a first aid kit secured beneath the front seat. She had noticed it when she got into the car in Beacon Hill, because 7 years in an emergency room gave a person the habit of remembering where such things were, without consciously trying. Enzo sat down beside her. Bruno started the engine. The car rolled away from the warehouse district, and Delaney pulled the left arm of the most dangerous man in Boston toward her without asking permission. She pushed the sleeve of his sweater up to his elbow, The cut was about 4 finger joints long, running diagonally along his forearm, its edges slightly ragged, the kind of wound left by a rusted metal shelf rather than a knife. It hadn't reached the muscle, but it was dirty. "This needs stitches," she said. "No. At the very least, it needs to be cleaned, and you need a tetanus shot. When was your last one?" "I don't remember. Then it's been too long." She opened the first aid kit, snapped open a vial of saline, and began doing what her hands had done thousands of times, so often that they no longer needed her mind. Rinse, blot, press, gauze, bandage. In the cramped back seat, her knee touched his every time the car passed over a pothole, and neither of them moved away. Streetlights washed across the windows in steady intervals, light and darkness, light and darkness. And during those moments of light, Delaney saw things she shouldn't have wanted to see. An old scar crossing the back of his hand. Another one, smaller, near his wrist beside the watch with its scratched glass. His skin was warmer than she had imagined. He didn't flinch once when she pressed the gauze against the wound, not even when she pressed harder than necessary. She had done this 1,000 times. She knew exactly how firmly to press and how tightly to wrap the bandage, and yet her fingers were trembling. She tried to hold them still, but they kept trembling, and she hated that more than anything else that had happened that night. "What are you looking at?" she asked, her eyes still fixed on the roll of bandage. Enzo didn't answer immediately. He let her wrap it around his arm twice more before he spoke. "The only person in this city who isn't afraid of me. I am afraid." Delaney tied the bandage a little tighter than necessary. "I've just been too busy to get around to it yet." A very quiet sound came from him. Perhaps an exhale, perhaps a laugh. She didn't look up to find out. She began putting everything away, rolling up the unused gauze, and replacing the cap on the saline bottle. And she realized her hands were doing those things far more slowly than necessary, because as long as they remained busy, she didn't have to think. "Sloane told me not to trust you," she said. "I know. Aren't you going to say anything?" "Not tonight." Delaney closed the first aid kit, and at last there was nothing left for her to do. She sat upright with both hands resting on her thighs, and in that instant, everything she had kept at a distance for the past 2 hours came rushing back all at once. She was lying face down on the cold concrete, counting footsteps. She heard a body sliding down the sheet metal wall. She saw Sloane's face turn deathly pale for a fraction of a second. Her chest tightened. She drew in a breath, but the air went only halfway before stopping. She tried again, shorter this time, then again, and each breath was shorter than the one before it. She knew exactly what was happening, because she had taught hundreds of people how to escape it. She knew she had to count backward, knew she had to breathe out longer than she breathed in. She knew everything, and she couldn't do any of it. Then a hand settled against the back of her neck. Warm, heavy. It didn't pull her or hold her. It simply rested there, and his thumb touched the pulse at the side of her neck, and remained still. "Breathe, Delaney," she breathed, not because he had told her to, but because her entire body suddenly had a point of support. One single place within herself that she could feel clearly, and everything else slowly found its way back around that point. Her breaths lengthened, her chest opened. She sat that way for she didn't know how long. Her eyes closed, her forehead almost touching his shoulder but not quite, and neither of them spoke a word. When she opened her eyes, his hand had already withdrawn. He was looking straight ahead as though nothing had happened, and Delaney was more grateful to him for that than she wanted to admit. She turned toward the window. She waited for the bridge, for the familiar turn leading down toward Dorchester, for the sign of the laundromat that stayed lit all night. The one she had seen before, getting off the bus for the past 7 years. None of them appeared. The car turned right and began climbing a hill, and the sidewalk bricks started sinking in the way they had since the last century. "This isn't the way to my apartment," Delaney said. "No," Enzo replied. He said nothing else, and she asked nothing else, and that frightened her more than anything had since she walked out of the warehouse. The house stood at the highest point of the hill, 3 stories of red brick with narrow windows, and there was nothing to distinguish it from the 24 other houses along the same street, except that every light inside was off, and the front door opened before Enzo could touch the handle. Delaney stepped inside without saying a word. She had intended to argue. During the entire drive up the hill, she had prepared 3 sentences in her mind. But when the door closed behind her, she understood that arguing at 4 o'clock in the morning with a man who had just allowed her to bandage his arm was pointless, so she did something else instead. She walked. She moved from the foyer into the living room, then from the living room into the kitchen, doing what 7 years of night shifts had embedded so deeply inside her that she no longer realized she was doing it. She counted the exits. Front door, 1. Kitchen door leading to the backyard, 2. With a lock at the top and another at the bottom. The living room windows reached the ceiling, but their frames were fixed and couldn't be opened, so they didn't count. The staircase to the second floor, 3. Though it was only an exit if there was another way out at the far end of the upper floor. In the emergency room, people taught one another that the first thing to do when entering an unfamiliar room was to know how they would leave it, and Delaney had done that in every room she had entered for 7 years, even churches, even grocery stores. Enzo stood in the kitchen pouring water, neither watching her nor asking what she was doing. He let her walk. She went upstairs. The second-floor hallway was covered in thick carpeting, with 4 doors, 3 of them slightly open. An empty bedroom with sheets stretched so smooth that they looked as though no one had ever slept there. A bathroom. A room filled with unopened cardboard boxes, several of them already coated in dust. The 4th door stood at the end of the hallway. It was firmly closed. Delaney placed her hand on the knob and turned it. The knob didn't move. It wasn't stuck. It was locked. She stood there longer than necessary, her hand still resting on the cold metal. And throughout the walk back downstairs, she could hear the echo of her own footsteps inside her head. Enzo said only one thing to her before she entered the empty bedroom. "We'll talk in the morning." There wasn't a sound in the house all night, and Delaney lay listening to that silence until the sky changed from black to gray. She slept for about 2 hours. When she woke, the clothes she had worn the night before still smelled of the warehouse, of damp concrete and rusted metal, and on the chair beside the bed lay a neatly folded white shirt and a pair of soft trousers, both far too large for her, both placed there silently at some point without her hearing a thing. She put on the shirt and rolled the sleeves twice. It was so loose that she had to tie one side of the hem. The fabric was soft and clean and carried the faint scent of cedar, and Delaney stood in front of the mirror longer than she was willing to admit to herself. Downstairs, Enzo stood beside the kitchen island. He wore a dark shirt, the white bandage on his left arm visible beneath a sleeve rolled high, and a coffee machine was dripping in front of him. He looked up when she entered, and for one brief moment, no longer than a single breath, his face didn't have time to return to its usual expression. Delaney saw that moment. He knew she had seen it. They both pretended nothing had happened. He poured coffee into 2 cups and pushed one toward her. Delaney reached for it, and her fingers touched his against the hot porcelain rim. They both pulled away. The cup tipped, spilling a little coffee across the stone counter, and they both reached for a paper towel, then both stopped halfway. "Let me," Delaney said. She wiped up the coffee with 3 decisive strokes, the way a person cleaned while someone else was bleeding, then tossed the towel into the trash, picked up her cup, and took a drink without caring how hot it was. He watched her. He didn't mention what had just happened. Neither did she. But something had shifted inside that kitchen, and they both knew it. "The bandage needs changing," she said, setting down her cup. "Later. Now." He held out his arm. She removed the old bandage, examined the edges of the wound, and while her hands worked, her mouth opened and said something she hadn't prepared at all. "I have to go to work tonight," she said. "You can't go. You didn't ask whether I wanted to." "No," Enzo replied. "I didn't ask." Delaney finished the last layer of bandage and tied it. Then she looked up. "Do you know what has frightened me most since last night?" she said. "Not the warehouse, not those 2 men, not who you are. I've worked in a South Boston emergency room for 7 years. Do you think I've never met someone like you? I've bandaged men far worse than you. Then what is it?" Delaney looked down at her hands. "Last night, you told me to get into the car, and I did," she said. "You brought me here, and I didn't argue once. This morning, I put on your shirt and drank your coffee. And in the past 8 hours, not one person has called to ask where I am. Not one. Do you understand? I'm not afraid of your world. I'm afraid that I've grown so used to having no one hold me back that I could disappear for 2 days and this entire city would keep moving exactly as it always has." The kitchen fell silent. Enzo set his coffee cup down on the stone counter very gently, as though he were afraid the sound might break something. "I would know," he said. "What?" "If you disappeared, I would know." Delaney couldn't answer that. She picked up her cup, turned toward the window, and finished the rest of her coffee, while the sun finally climbed above the rooftops on the other side of the hill. By afternoon, the bandage had soaked through again, and Enzo was in his study, with the door partly closed, his low, even voice carrying into the hallway as an indistinct murmur without words. Delaney didn't knock. She went looking for the first aid kit, and because she didn't know where anything was kept in that house, she opened the drawer in the hallway table first, then the cabinet beneath the sink, then the low cupboard against the living room wall. There were no bandages or gauze in the top drawer of that cupboard. There were 3 things inside: a coil of cord, a set of car keys without a keychain, and a pink phone case with one corner peeling away, covered in stickers of little cats. The phone Delaney had seen thousands of times on coffee tables, inside handbags, and resting on the lid of a toilet tank in a bar on Boylston Street when they were both 23. She picked it up. The screen came to life the moment her finger touched it. The battery was at 61%. There was no password. Delaney stood in the middle of the living room with the phone in her hand, listening to her heart beat very slowly, strangely slowly, the same kind of slow rhythm she had seen in patients just before they understood what was happening to them. She opened the messages. Her name was at the top. She tapped it. The last message had been sent at 9:04 the night before last. Laney, help. I'm going to Providence for 2 days, and all my plants are about to die. Can you go water them for me and pick up my mail while you're there? The key is still in the usual place. I'll owe you for the rest of my life. 3 smiling faces. Delaney scrolled upward. Above that message was a long, blank space. The previous message from Sloane had been sent 4 days earlier, and its wording was entirely different. Its tone entirely different. Its punctuation entirely different. Sloane never wrote, "The key is still in the usual place." Sloane always wrote, "The key is under the planter, you idiot." In 7 years of texting each other, Sloane had never once called the ceramic planter in the hallway the usual place. Delaney crossed the living room, went down the hallway, and pushed open the study door without knocking. Enzo looked up, his phone still pressed to his ear. He saw what she was holding and didn't look confused, didn't rise abruptly, didn't reach for it. He merely spoke 3 words into the phone, then ended the call. "This belongs to Sloane," Delaney said. "Yes. How long have you had it?" "Since Saturday afternoon. My people found it in her car in the parking garage." "Then who sent the message the night before last?" Enzo placed his phone on the desk. He didn't avoid her gaze for even a second, and later, when Delaney remembered that afternoon, she would realize that his refusal to look away was what hurt her most. "I did," he said. The room tilted slightly. "You sent it?" "Yes. You sent me a message from her phone, pretending to be her, so I would go there." Delaney heard her voice rising, and she couldn't stop it. "I stood in the darkness of that apartment, believing my friend was in Providence. I was worried about her plants. I picked up that set of keys and thought about how I had to start my shift at 7 o'clock the next evening, and you were already sitting in that chair, waiting to see who walked through the door. I needed to know who was still in contact with her," Enzo said. "Over the past 3 months, 4 people received messages from that number. 3 of them didn't come. So you weren't looking for me." Delaney stepped closer. "You set out bait, and I was the only fish that bit, wasn't I?" Silence. He didn't deny it. He didn't offer another word of explanation, and that honesty was worse than a lie, because she could have become angry at a lie and eventually moved past it. But this was something she had to swallow whole. "Do you know what I do for a living?" she said. Her voice was suddenly very calm, and she recognized it as the voice she used with a patient's family at 3 o'clock in the morning when everything had already gone wrong. "I work in a profession where 15 strangers lie in front of me every night, and not one of them tells me the truth. Everyone hides something. How much they drank, what they took, where they fell, who hit them. I'm used to it. I don't need people to tell me the truth." She raised the phone in its pink case. "But I need to know where I'm standing. And you let me stand in a dark room for 10 minutes without knowing that I had been turned into a test." She placed the phone on the edge of the desk. It lay there, pink case and cat stickers, among the beige folders. "I'm leaving," she said. She turned away. She walked down the hallway, through the living room, and she remembered exactly where the front door was, because the night before she had counted it as exit number 1. She heard the chair scrape backward behind her. She didn't hear footsteps following. He didn't chase her. He only spoke from the study doorway, without raising his voice, in the same even tone he always used when speaking of things that had already been done. "I set the bait because I didn't know who you were." Delaney stopped. Her hand was already resting on the doorknob. "3 weeks ago, you saved my life and accepted nothing in return," he continued. "No one in my life has ever done that without wanting something afterward. So I didn't trust you. I had to see what you would do. And you did the worst thing you could possibly have done to me, Delaney. You walked into that dark room because of a potted plant." Delaney remained still. Her fingers were still wrapped around the brass doorknob, and the metal had grown warm beneath her palm. Outside was the brick-paved hill, the bus, the basement apartment with the stack of unopened white envelopes on the kitchen table, the 7 o'clock shift, and Miriam asking where she had been the night before. Everything was still there. Everything was waiting for her. She didn't open the door. She didn't turn around either. She simply stood there with her hand on the knob, and she remained that way for a very long time. She stayed. Not because she had forgiven him, but because there was nowhere else she could go without dragging something behind her. And the next 4 days passed inside the red brick house, according to a rhythm Delaney gradually learned by heart. Bruno arrived in the morning and left in the evening. People called. The study door closed, then opened, then closed again. She changed Enzo's bandage once each day, and every time it took less than 4 minutes. And during those 4 minutes, neither of them mentioned the phone in the pink case again. On Thursday afternoon, Bruno brought her a bag of clothes and a stack of mail from the apartment on Dorchester Street. Delaney sat at the kitchen table and opened each envelope one by one. And in the middle of the familiar stack of white envelopes was one that looked entirely different, made of heavier paper, and printed with the name of a bank instead of a collection agency. She opened it. She read the first line. Then she began again and read it more slowly, because her eyes could see the words, but her mind refused to accept them. Payment account number 4721. Medical loan under the name Wesley Cross. Remaining balance of $94,312. Paid in full on the 21st of this month. Current balance, 0. No further obligation remains. Delaney sat completely still for a very long time. 7 years. For 7 years, she had taken the 4:10 morning bus. For 7 years, she had accepted so many extra shifts that Miriam had once hidden the schedule so Delaney couldn't sign up for any more. For 7 years, she hadn't bought herself a new pair of shoes, hadn't taken a single day of vacation, hadn't dared to think about moving out of that damp basement. For 7 years, that number had sat on her kitchen table like a third person living in the apartment, and now it was gone, and someone had erased it on an afternoon she couldn't even name. She found him in the study. She placed the letter on the desk directly in front of him. "This was you," she said. Enzo looked at the page. He didn't pick it up. He read the first line, then raised his eyes, and something moved across his face so quickly that Delaney couldn't understand it in time. "What do you want me to say?" he asked. "I want you to tell me why." He didn't answer immediately. In those 2 seconds of silence, Delaney had time to think of everything she wanted to say, and then she said it all at once. "You didn't ask me. You've never asked me a single question. You sent a message pretending to be my friend. You brought me here, and now you've erased the debt I paid every month for 7 years, the debt that carried my brother's name. Do you know how much I paid each month? $460. Do you know how long it took me to save $460? Do you think you just gave me a gift?" "No," Enzo said. "Then what did you think you were doing?" "I thought it was a chain," he replied. Delaney stopped. "Whoever held your debt knew where you lived, where you worked, what time your shift ended, and that person had the right to take your name to court whenever they wanted more information." He spoke slowly, as though explaining something obvious to someone who didn't belong to his world. "As long as the name Delaney Cross remained in someone's debt ledger, you were still a cord that could be pulled. I cut that cord. That's all. Don't turn it into anything else." She stood there as the anger inside her chest began to drain away, and losing it felt worse than keeping it, because when she was angry, she knew exactly where she stood. She wanted to thank him. She couldn't. She picked up the letter, folded it into quarters, and slipped it into her pocket. And she thought about how that night she would lie down without a stack of white envelopes waiting on the kitchen table, and she didn't know whether she was supposed to feel relieved or empty. She couldn't sleep that night. At 4 o'clock in the morning, she went downstairs for water, and the study door stood wide open, the desk lamp still burning, but no one was sitting behind the desk. Enzo was sitting on the floor. His back rested against the leg of an armchair, one leg stretched out and the other bent, with files scattered all around him. They covered the carpet. Some were stacked into piles. Some piles had fallen over, and papers had spilled out like leaves. He was still wearing the clothes from the day before. 3 days of beard shadowed his jaw. Beneath his eyes were 2 dark hollows Delaney had seen 1,000 times in the emergency room, on the faces of people who had stayed on duty for too long, and she knew exactly what they meant. 3 nights. At least 3 nights. He looked up when she entered, and he said nothing. Neither did she. She didn't ask what he was searching for among all those papers. She didn't tell him to go to bed, because telling a man like him to sleep was pointless, and she had learned that when she was 21, she stepped carefully around the piles of files, then lowered herself to the floor beside him, her back resting against the same chair leg, both knees drawn up. She didn't touch him. She only sat there. 10 minutes passed without a word from either of them. The desk lamp made a faint humming sound. Beyond the window, the brick-paved hill was still dark. Then Delaney felt his weight beginning to lean toward her, very slowly, little by little, like an old building finally allowing itself to sit down. His head came to rest against her shoulder. His breathing changed, growing longer and steadier, and the man all of Boston was supposed to fear was sleeping on the shoulder of a night shift nurse in the middle of a floor covered with papers. Delaney sat perfectly still. Her shoulder slowly went numb, then lost all feeling, and she didn't move away. She could have moved. She could have awakened him, could have stood up and gone to get the glass of water she had come downstairs for. She did none of those things. She sat there until the sky beyond the window changed from black to gray, and in 7 years, it was the most frightening thing she had ever allowed herself to do. Sloane called the following afternoon from an unfamiliar number, and the first thing she said was, "Lainey, can you come outside, alone, and don't tell anyone?" Delaney stood in the kitchen with the phone pressed to her ear and looked into the hallway, where Bruno sat on the wooden chair beside the front door, just as he had sat there from morning until evening. "I'm not sure I can get out," she said. "Then I'll come in." 40 minutes later, Sloane stood in the living room of the red brick house, and Bruno had called someone before opening the door, while Enzo was somewhere on the other side of the city. Sloane didn't take off her coat. She had grown visibly thinner in only a week, and she kept standing instead of sitting, both hands gripping the strap of her purse. "How long have you been here?" Sloane asked. 6 days. "Which room are you sleeping in?" "The empty room on the 2nd floor." Sloane gave a very short laugh, and there was nothing amused in it. "My uncle has never allowed anyone to sleep on the 2nd floor." She set her purse on the chair, opened it, and took out an envelope. It wasn't the brown envelope from the warehouse. Enzo had taken that one. This one was smaller, with worn edges, the kind of envelope people use to hold photographs printed at a shop. "You think I owe gambling debts, don't you?" Sloane said. "Is that what my uncle told you?" "He hasn't told me anything." "Good, because I don't owe anyone a cent. I've been buying something. I've been buying it for 3 years. She took out a photograph and placed it face down on the low table between them, then rested her hand over it without turning it over right away. "My father died 3 years ago," Sloane said. "They said it was his heart. They said he collapsed in the garage of the old house in Wellesley near midnight, and no one else was there. I believed that for a year. Then I found my father's former driver. He had left his job and moved to Lowell, and he told me one thing, then refused to say anything else until I paid him. He said the garage wasn't empty that night." Delaney looked at Sloane's hand resting on the photograph. Her fingernails had been bitten down into the flesh, something Delaney had never seen her do in 7 years. "He sold it to me one piece at a time," Sloane continued. "One name, $3,000. One point in the timeline, $5,000. Every time I finished paying him, he suddenly remembered something else. Last month, he told me there was one final piece, and that final piece cost more than everything before it put together. That was what I was counting the money to buy in the warehouse that night. Then my uncle walked in and took it away." She turned the photograph over. It was an image from a security camera, printed on ordinary paper, poor in quality and washed in a gray-blue cast. A string of numbers showing the date and time appeared in the upper right corner. The frame showed the entrance to a garage, with the rolling door raised about 2/3 of the way. And at the far left edge of the picture was an arm. Only an arm. Someone was reaching upward to pull the door down, the rest of the body already outside the frame, leaving only the part from the elbow downward visible. There was a watch on that wrist. Delaney leaned closer. The image was blurred, but the watch had a square face and a dark leather strap, and near one corner of the glass was a slanted streak of light, the kind of uneven reflection only scratched glass could create. She had seen that watch in the car on the drive back from Charlestown. She had seen it every time she lifted his left forearm to change the bandage. She had seen it that morning on the wrist of the man sleeping against her shoulder at 4 o'clock. The date and time in the corner of the image read 11:42 at night on August 19th, 3 years earlier. "This doesn't prove anything," Delaney said, and she heard her voice weaken on the final word. "I know," Sloane replied. "That's why I was trying to buy the final piece." She picked up the photograph and slipped it back into the envelope, slowly and carefully, like someone putting away an object she had held and examined far too many times. "Lainey," she said, "I didn't come here to tell you to hate my uncle. I know what he paid for you, Bruno told me." Delaney said nothing. "You think he did it because you're my friend," Sloane said. "He didn't. I grew up in that house. I've watched him since I was 7. My uncle never falls for anyone. My uncle chooses, and once he has chosen something, this entire city has to pay the price for that choice, including the thing he chose." She lifted the strap of her purse onto her shoulder. "You've been here for 6 days, and you haven't gone to work. You haven't called anyone, and no one has called you. Does that feel normal to you? It feels very familiar to me, because I once saw it happen exactly this way." She walked toward the door. When she reached the threshold, she stopped, and when she turned back, her eyes were red and her voice broke in the middle of the sentence, the way it had when she was 17, and standing in the hallway of the funeral home. "I've never asked you to repay me for anything," Sloane said. "But today, I'm asking you for one thing. Don't stay here." Then she left. Delaney remained in the middle of the living room long after the sound of the engine had faded at the bottom of the hill. She looked at the armchair in the study, at the chair leg she had rested her back against for 3 hours the night before. She thought about the door at the end of the second-floor hallway, the only door in the entire house with a lock. And for the first time since the night at the warehouse, she wondered not what he had done, but why she hadn't asked even once during the past 6 days. The rain began at 9 o'clock that night, the kind of October rain Boston was known for, rain that didn't fall so much as lash sideways, striking the narrow windows in waves. Enzo came home close to 11, the shoulders of his coat dark with water, and before he had finished hanging it up, Delaney was already standing at the far end of the hallway. "Sloane came here this afternoon," she said. "I know. She showed me a photograph." Enzo's hand stopped. He didn't turn around immediately, and Delaney saw his shoulders lower by perhaps half an inch, the way a man's shoulders lowered when he had just heard the very thing he had been waiting to hear for 3 years. "A security camera image," she continued. "The garage at the old house in Wellesley, 11:42 at night, on August 19th. There was an arm in the frame, pulling down the rolling door. On that wrist was a square-faced watch with a dark leather strap and glass scratched near one corner." She looked down at his left wrist. "It's right there." Enzo turned around. He didn't look at his wrist. He looked directly at her, and during those few seconds, Delaney prepared herself for everything. For a denial, for a polished explanation, for anger. He gave her none of them. "It is my watch," he said. Delaney heard the rain striking the windows. "You were there. I was there. Did you kill Sloane's father?" The question fell between them in the hallway, and lay there without moving. Enzo didn't answer. He came closer, not quickly, and stopped about 2 steps away, at the exact distance he had maintained for the past 6 days as though it had been measured in advance. "I will tell you," he said, "everything. I won't hide a single word, but not tonight." "Why?" "Because if I tell you tonight, you'll stay because you feel sorry for me," Enzo replied. "And I don't want you to stay for that reason." He reached into his coat pocket and took out a set of keys, not the house keys, car keys. He placed them on the low table against the wall between them, then withdrew his hand. "The car is at the bottom of the hill," he said. "No one will follow you. Bruno will open the gate if you tell him to. Your debt is gone, and no one can use your name anymore. You can go back to Dorchester tonight, and tomorrow morning you can return to work exactly as before. From this moment on, nothing is forcing you to remain in this house." Delaney looked at the keys. "What about you?" she said. "I will stay here." He said nothing else. He made no promises, offered no explanation. gave her no reason why she should remain. And Delaney stood there and understood that for the first time in her life, a man had placed the entire choice on the table and stepped away, and she didn't know what to do with that. All her life, everything had arrived with a price already written beside it. Her mother had worked 3 jobs at once and paid with herself. At 21, Delaney had signed for the debt bearing her brother's name because there had been no one else left to sign. The man she had planned to marry when she was 25 had stayed exactly 3 weeks after learning the amount, then disappeared. No one had ever given her something and told her she could decide whether she wanted it. "I'm not taking the keys," she said. "I know. How do you know?" "Because if you intended to leave, you would have left the night you found the phone in the drawer," Enzo replied. A short laugh escaped Delaney, and it sounded almost like a sob. She raised one hand and rubbed her eyes hard, the way someone did after a 12-hour shift. "You don't understand," she said. "I'm not good at this. I've never done this before." "Done what?" "This." She gestured toward the empty space between them. "I'm 28 years old, and I've never let anyone come this close. Not because I was protecting myself for someone. Not because I was waiting. No one has ever stayed long enough to ask whether I wanted them to." "I know." Her head snapped up. "How do you know?" "Because you hold your breath every time I come near you," Enzo said. "The first night in Sloane's apartment, you held your breath. In the car, when I put my hand against the back of your neck, you held your breath. The next morning in the kitchen, when your hand touched mine, you held your breath." He stepped closer, and now less than an arm's length remained between them. "And every time, you didn't step away," he said. Rain struck the windows. Outside, the streetlight at the bottom of the hill cast a long streak of light across the hallway ceiling. Then it vanished as a car passed. Delaney stood still, and she heard her own breathing stop once again, exactly as he had said, and she hated that he was right so much that she couldn't move. She didn't step back. She stepped forward. She was the one who moved first, and later, whenever she remembered that rainy night, she would always remember that detail exactly, that she had stepped forward first, that she had raised her hand and placed it against the front of his shirt, still damp from the rain, and that he had remained completely still until she had finished doing it. Then his hands rose. One settled at her waist, the other at the back of her neck, in the same place where his thumb had rested inside the car on the night in Charlestown, and he lowered his head. The kiss was nothing like anything Delaney had prepared herself to endure. She had expected something forceful, quick, possessive, something suited to the man the entire city was supposed to fear. But he kissed her so slowly that it was almost tender, and it was that slowness that made her tremble. Her hands closed around the fabric of his shirt. She felt his heartbeat beneath her palm, moving far faster than the man on the outside ever seemed to move, and for some reason that was what caught in her throat. Then he stopped. He was the one who stepped away first, his breathing still uneven, his forehead resting against hers. "That is enough," he said quietly. Delaney opened her eyes. "I didn't tell you to stop." "I know," Enzo replied. "But tonight you saw my wrist in a photograph. I don't want you to give me anything on the night when you're more afraid of me than you have ever been." He released her. He picked up the car keys from the low table and placed them in her palm, closing her fingers around them, then walked upstairs without looking back. Delaney stood alone in the hallway with the keys in her hand and the rain beating against the roof, and she remained there until the metal in her palm had warmed to the temperature of her own body. 2 days later, the mail from Dorchester was brought over again, and among it was another envelope from the bank. Delaney opened it at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee still hot beside her hand. It was only a final confirmation letter, the kind of document banks sent one more time after an account had been settled, listing the transfer history of the loan for their records. She skimmed it because she already knew the outcome, then her eyes stopped on the third line from the bottom. The loan hadn't been paid to the bank. It had been paid to a third party, a company that had purchased the loan earlier. The recipient of the payment, the line stated clearly, was Harborline Asset Recovery LLC, registered at an office building in Charlestown. Date of transfer, March of the previous year. Delaney read it 3 times. March of the previous year. 19 months ago. Before that Tuesday night in the emergency room. Before she even knew there was a man in the world named Enzo Castellani. She carried the paper into the study and placed it in front of him. And this time she said nothing. She only pointed to that line. Enzo read it. He read it very quickly the first time, then read it again much more slowly, and Delaney saw something she hadn't seen on his face during the past 8 days. He didn't know. She understood that before he even opened his mouth, because she had watched thousands of faces receive bad news in hospital hallways, and she knew exactly what that sudden tightening around the jaw meant. "You paid this company," she said. "My people paid whoever held the loan," Enzo replied. "They didn't trace the ownership backward. No one did because there was no reason to. It was medical debt. Every year in this city, tens of thousands of debts like that are bought and sold." "What kind of company is Harborline?" He didn't answer immediately. He opened his laptop, typed several lines, waited, then turned the screen toward her. It showed a state business registration page, the company name, the date it had been established, and the name of a representative Delaney had never heard before. Enzo pointed to the registered address. "This building," he said. "The 4th floor. There are 6 companies on the 4th floor. All 6 belong to one man." "Who?" "Cormac Doyle." The room fell silent. Outside the window, a garbage truck was reversing at the top of the hill, its warning signal beeping at steady intervals. Perfectly ordinary, perfectly suited to an ordinary morning. "Doyle buys medical debt in bulk," Enzo continued, and his voice slowed as though he himself were fitting the pieces into place while he spoke. "Hospitals sell difficult accounts for a few cents on the dollar. Anyone can buy them. He buys thousands at a time, gathers them together, then gradually filters through them. Most are only used to collect money, but among thousands of names, there will always be a few people who work somewhere worth knowing about. Police departments, courts, customs, banks." Delaney heard her own voice come out very softly. "Hospitals, yes." She lowered herself onto the edge of the chair. She wasn't angry. That was the strangest part, and it would be a long time before she understood why. The night she found the phone in the pink case inside the drawer, she had been so angry that she could barely stand, because she had believed she was being dragged into something that didn't belong to her. Now she understood that she had been inside it for 19 months, since before she had known anyone she could lose, back when she was still taking the 4:10 morning bus, sitting in the 3rd row, with nothing in the world for anyone to take from her. She hadn't been dragged in. Her name had already been on the list. "The man who came asking about my work schedule," she said, "at the reception desk, about 12 days ago." Enzo raised his eyes very slowly. "You never told me about that, because I thought it was nothing," Delaney said. "Where I work, strangers ask questions every day. I work in South Boston, not in a bank." She lowered her eyes to her hands, the skin dry and cracked from antiseptic. The hands she had always believed were the only things in the world she truly owned. "For 7 years I thought that number belonged to me," she said. "I hated it, but it was mine. It carried my brother's name. Every month, I paid $460, and I believed I was paying towards something that meant something. It turns out that since March of last year, I've been paying him, month after month, and I didn't even know his name." Enzo stood and walked around the desk. He didn't touch her. He only stood close, within the familiar distance of 2 steps. "You're safe in this house," he said. "I'm not afraid for myself." Delaney looked up, and her voice broke in the middle of the sentence. "He has had my name for 19 months. He knows I work nights, knows which entrance I use, knows I stand with Miriam on the back steps at 3 o'clock in the morning to get some air. Do you think my name is the only one he has? What about everyone around me?" That question remained in the room for the rest of the day, and no one could take it down. Delaney called Miriam 3 times that afternoon. The first time, Miriam didn't answer because she was working. The second time, she sent back a single line. "What is wrong with you? I'm busy." The third time, close to 8 o'clock that evening, she answered and scolded Delaney for disappearing from work for 9 days without permission, then told her to go home and sleep, that she was working the night shift the following day, that she would bake on Sunday, and that Delaney had better come over and eat. "Thank you, Miriam," Delaney said. Miriam ended the call first. That night, Delaney slept for the first time in days. Her phone vibrated at 2:40 in the morning. The screen showed the name of the St. Brigid's Mercy Hospital switchboard. The switchboard operator was a young woman Delaney didn't recognize, and she followed procedure exactly, speaking slowly and clearly, in the voice people were trained to use when calling a family member at 2 o'clock in the morning. "Is this Miss Cross? You are listed as the emergency contact for Miriam Pruitt." Delaney had already bolted upright in the darkness before the young woman finished the sentence. "What happened to her?" Miss Pruitt is currently in intensive care. You may come up at any time." Delaney ran downstairs barefoot, and Enzo was already standing in the foyer with his coat draped over one arm, as though he had known in advance, and perhaps he truly had, because Bruno was outside opening the car door, and the engine was already running. No one spoke during the drive across the bridge. At St. Bridget's, Delaney walked through hallways she had crossed thousands of times, past the reception desk where 12 days earlier she had heard something she dismissed as insignificant, and when the night receptionist saw her, she sprang to her feet. "Miss Cross, what happened?" They found her in the employee parking lot, close to 1 o'clock, after her shift ended. Security found her during their second round. Delaney stood outside the glass doors of the intensive care unit. Inside, Miriam Pruitt lay with a breathing tube in place, and a heart monitor kept a steady rhythm near the head of the bed, and Delaney read the numbers on the screen through professional instinct before she managed to look at Miriam's face. Low blood pressure, stable heart rate. She understood what those numbers meant, and she clung to them as though they were the side of a ship. The attending physician said only one sentence that she heard in full, that if Miriam made it through the night, she would make it. Then Delaney looked toward the cart holding the patient's personal belongings beside the wall, and inside the clear plastic bag on top was a moss-green cloth coat with a worn collar and a second button that had been replaced with one of a different color. Delaney went completely still. She had sewn that button on in February. The coat belonged to her. She had left it in the staff lounge after her final shift 9 days earlier, hanging from the third hook from the door, and Miriam was always cold, and Miriam always grabbed whatever happened to be hanging there when she walked out to the parking lot, and she had done that for 7 years. There were no lights in the eastern corner of the employee lot. A silver-haired woman in the darkness, wearing the moss-green coat everyone knew belonged to someone else. Delaney turned into the hallway and walked quickly, faster and faster, until she reached the emergency stairwell where no one else was present, and Enzo followed her. She spun around and struck him in the chest. It wasn't a slap. She punched him with both fists, once and then again, and she heard her own voice breaking apart into fragments. She is 62 years old. She has worked here for 31 years. She put on my coat by mistake. All she did was put on the wrong coat. Enzo didn't move away. He didn't raise his hands to protect himself, didn't step back even half a pace, didn't say a single word to make her stop. He stood there and took every blow, and Delaney kept hitting him until her arms gave out and she could no longer remain standing. And only when her knees buckled did he reach for her, catching her before she struck the floor. She cried there on the emergency stairs of her own hospital, her face buried against the shoulder of a man the entire city was supposed to fear, and he didn't offer a single word of comfort. He only held her. They returned to the red brick house at 4 o'clock in the morning. Bruno carried a small cardboard box in through the back door, without postage or a sender's name, placed neatly on the doorstep. He had already inspected it. There was only one object inside, a hospital identification badge with a pale blue background, showing a silver-haired woman smiling because she smiled even for identification photographs, with the words M. Pruitt, head nurse. A dark stain had dried across the plastic surface. Delaney looked at it for exactly 3 seconds, then turned away. She went upstairs. She stood in the empty bedroom, surrounded by things that didn't belong to her, and she understood that the box hadn't been sent to frighten her. It was a message, and the message said that they knew they had taken the wrong person, and they wanted her to know that they knew. She stepped into the hallway. She walked to the second door, not the locked door at the end of the hall, but the door to his bedroom, and knocked twice. He opened it immediately, still fully dressed, still not having lain down. Delaney said nothing. She walked past him into the room, took off her shoes, and lay down along the outer edge of the bed with her face turned toward the wall and her knees drawn up. She didn't explain. She didn't ask permission. Behind her, the door closed very softly. She heard him walk around the foot of the bed. She heard the blanket being lifted and drawn over her shoulders with care, using both hands, the way someone covered a sleeping person they didn't want to wake. Then she heard him sit in the armchair in the corner. There was no sound of the mattress sinking beside her. No hand touched her. Not a single word was spoken. There was only the breathing of 2 people in a dark room, and the rain, now softened to a quiet patter across the roof. Delaney didn't know when she fell asleep. When she opened her eyes, daylight had filled the room, and she was alone. The armchair in the corner was empty, and the blanket there had been folded into a perfect square. She sat up, And on the pillow beside the place where she had slept, an object had been placed neatly in the exact center. A square-faced watch with a dark leather strap and a scratch slanting across one corner of the glass. The one thing he had never removed from his wrist even once during the 9 days she had spent inside that house. Delaney picked it up, and the metal on the back was still warm. Miriam made it through that night, and through the night after that. And on the third day, the doctor told Delaney that she was stable, and all they could do now was wait. Delaney went to the hospital every day. Bruno drove her and sat outside in the hallway reading the newspaper for 3 hours, and that was the only arrangement she agreed to. On Tuesday afternoon, she left the intensive care unit and, instead of taking the main elevator, she used the western corridor because it was shorter, the hallway leading to the outpatient dialysis wing that she had walked through several hundred times during her 7 years there. Through the glass window of dialysis, room number 2, she saw a man reclining in a treatment chair, a thin blanket spread across his lap, one arm resting on a padded support. He was close to 60, with short gray hair, a square face, and a heavy jaw. Delaney walked 3 steps past him, then stopped. She had seen that face before. Not in the hospital, on the screen of a phone inside a car 4 days earlier, when Enzo had turned it toward her and said, "This is the man I have to meet tonight." She even remembered the mole beside his left temple. She turned back. She stood about 2 meters from the glass and pretended to read the duty roster posted on the wall, and she remained there for exactly 40 seconds. A nurse entered the room carrying a file, checked the machine, then spoke to the man in the pleasant voice every afternoon nurse used. "Your blood pressure looks very good today, Mr. Callahan. Only 40 more minutes to go." The man smiled, thanked her, then closed his eyes again. Callahan. Delaney continued toward the elevator, walking normally and very slowly, both hands tucked into the pockets of her coat, because 7 years in the emergency room had taught her that when the heart was beating fastest, the feet had to move most steadily. She stood alone in the elevator and watched the numbers descend from the 4th floor to the 1st, and during those 20 seconds, she rearranged everything she knew, 3 times a week. Monday, Wednesday, Friday, afternoon session, room number 2. A name that wasn't his real name. No guard outside, no men in dark coats in the hallway, no one at all, because if there had been, the entire hospital would have been talking about it long ago. That meant no one was supposed to know. It meant he came there alone 3 times a week, and sat motionless for 4 hours with a needle in his arm, and even his own people didn't know where he was. Delaney stepped out of the elevator, past Bruno where he was sitting, and told him she had forgotten her notebook upstairs and would be back in 10 minutes. Bruno nodded and turned to the next page of his newspaper. She returned to the 4th floor. She stopped at the staff lounge, took a small sheet of blank paper and a pen, and wrote 4 lines on it. She carried nothing else. No phone, no purse, nothing in her hands except the sheet of paper folded in half. She opened the door to dialysis room number 2, stepped inside, and closed it behind her. The man opened his eyes. For the first 3 seconds, he looked at her the way every patient looked at a nurse entering the room. Slightly indifferent, slightly expectant. Then he glanced down at the name badge on her chest, and something very small changed at the corner of his eyes. "Miss Cross," he said, "you know my name." "I know many names." He didn't appear frightened. He didn't press the call button. He only settled his head back against the cushion and watched her with the interest of a man who had been lying still for too long and had finally been given something to occupy him. 4 hours, Delaney said, 3 times a week. "Has it been 3 years or 4, Mr. Doyle?" He didn't answer. "I didn't come here to threaten you," she continued. "I can't do anything to you. I won't touch the machine. I won't touch you. And I won't touch anything in this room, because I'm a nurse and I took an oath. You can sit there and finish your remaining 40 minutes. Then why are you here?" Delaney placed the folded paper on the small table beside the treatment chair. "There are 4 lines on this," she said. "The department name, the room number, the time slot, and the false name you're using. My name isn't written anywhere. I made 4 copies just like it." He looked at the paper. He didn't reach for it. "Your people don't know," Delaney said. "Do they? For 3 years, you've sat in this room 3 times every week, while your people believed you were in meetings, at lunch, somewhere else. Because the day they learn you have to sit with a needle in your arm for 4 hours at a time, you're no longer the man in charge. You become an old man who is waiting. And in your world, no one ever waits beside anyone. The only sound in the room was the steady hum of the dialysis machine. a slow, low-pumping noise repeating over and over. "You sent someone to my workplace," she said, and for the first time her voice trembled slightly. "The night before last, a 62-year-old woman walked into the parking lot after her shift wearing my coat by mistake. She is lying on the 3rd floor, exactly 2 floors below where you're sitting. Do you know her name? I would wager you don't. To you, she is only a line in a report." Doyle slowly raised his free hand, picked up the paper, opened it, and read. He took longer than 4 lines should have required. Then he folded it again and placed it back exactly where it had been. "What do you plan to do with the other 3 copies?" he asked. "Nothing," Delaney said, "as long as no one else in this hospital has to walk into a dark parking lot because of me." He nodded once, very slowly, the kind of nod a man gave after hearing a number in a negotiation and weighing it in his mind. Then he smiled. It was a real smile, warm, almost kindly, the smile of an old man sitting in a dialysis chair and speaking to an afternoon nurse. "You have courage, Miss Cross," he said. "In 7 years, you're the first person who has dared to come in here alone." He closed his eyes. "But I have to tell you something. In the interest of fairness," he continued, his eyes still shut. "I didn't send anyone to this hospital parking lot. I don't touch the place where I receive treatment, Miss Cross. I never have." Delaney stood motionless. "Then who did?" she said. Doyle opened his eyes and looked at her. "You should ask Castellani how many people inside his own house know where you've been sleeping for the past 9 days, he said. "Then count how many of them I have paid." She told Enzo everything that evening, from beginning to end, including Doyle's final sentence, and she watched his face as she spoke. He wasn't angry that she had gone in alone. He asked only 2 questions: which chair the man had been sitting in and how many exits the room had, then remained silent for a very long time. "He was lying," Delaney said. "Possibly. Or possibly not." Enzo rose and walked to the window. "There are 11 people in this house who know you're here," he said. "I trust all 11 of them. The moment I begin to distrust them, I lose this house before I find out who it is." "Then what are you going to do?" "I'm going to let him sit with the thought that he has placed a grain of sand inside my shoe," Enzo replied, "and I'm going to keep walking as though there is nothing there." The next 2 days passed, in a kind of quiet Delaney didn't believe for a single second. Miriam's breathing tube had been removed, and she could speak in short sentences, and the first thing she said to Delaney was, "I'm fine. Go home and sleep." Sloane didn't call. Bruno still sat in the wooden chair beside the front door, still read the newspaper, still folded it into quarters along the same old creases. The square-faced watch remained in the drawer beside Delaney's bed, because she didn't know what to do with it, and Enzo hadn't asked for it back. On the 3rd night, close to 11 o'clock, Enzo's phone vibrated. He answered. He listened longer than usual, and said nothing except 2 words. "Where is she?" Then he ended the call and stood. "Sloane has been seen in Quincy," he said. "A motel off Route 3. She is with one of Doyle's men." "Are you certain?" "No," Enzo replied. "But if I don't go, I'll have to live with that." He put on his coat. 3 of his men were already waiting outside, Bruno holding the car keys, and after days of silence, the entire house suddenly filled with footsteps. Delaney stood at the foot of the stairs and felt something tighten painfully inside her chest, and she recognized it as something she hadn't possessed in 7 years. The thing people called fear of losing someone. "Delaney," Enzo said. He stopped at the threshold. "The doors downstairs lock from the inside. No one can enter through the ground floor. If anything happens, go upstairs, to the end of the hallway. The locked door. Your fingerprint has already been registered. The locked door." She had stood before it 9 days earlier and turned the knob, and it hadn't moved. "When did you register my fingerprint?" she asked. "On your 2nd day here." He made no promises. He didn't say, "I'll come back." Didn't say, "Don't worry." Didn't say, "I'll be here in 4 hours." He only lifted his hands and adjusted her collar, the collar of the oversized white shirt she had continued wearing for the past several days, settling it neatly beneath her sweater, slowly, with both hands, a completely unnecessary act that neither of them pretended was necessary. Then he lowered his hands and walked out the door. Delaney remained at the foot of the staircase until the sound of the final car disappeared at the bottom of the hill, and she stood there for a long time after that. She didn't sleep. She sat in the living room with a book whose words she couldn't read, and only 2 of Enzo's men remained in the house, one in the foyer and one in the kitchen. The clock above the fireplace read 1:47 in the morning when every light in the house went out at once. They didn't flicker. They didn't slowly dim. They went out, all at once, and even the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen stopped. And the silence that followed was so thick that Delaney could hear the blood moving through her ears. She stood. "Get down," the man in the foyer said. "Don't run. Get down." Delaney dropped to the floor behind the sofa in the living room, both hands covering her head, and for the next 7 minutes, she saw nothing. She only listened. First came the sound of the front door bolt. It wasn't being forced. It was being drawn back from the inside, metal sliding through its track. The sound Delaney had heard every evening for the past 9 days when Bruno locked the door before going to bed, and she recognized it immediately, and she couldn't understand why she was hearing it now. Then came the hinges. Then footsteps. Many of them. Far too many. Not 2 men. Pouring into the foyer all at once. One of Enzo's men gave a short shout, and the sound stopped halfway through. Something fell. Something wooden broke in half. Someone ran through the living room less than 2 steps from where she lay, and Delaney held her breath until pain stabbed through her chest. Then came the shots. Short and sharp, nothing like they sounded in movies, more like sheets of plywood striking a concrete floor. 3 shots, then a pause, then 2 more. Fine waves of plaster dust fell across the back of her shirt, carrying the smell of dry lime, hot metal, and gunpowder, a smell she had never encountered before in her life. The sofa above her jerked once. Something made of glass shattered near the kitchen, and the broken pieces skidded across the wooden floor. Then silence. That silence was worse than everything that had come before it, because while there was noise, Delaney could still tell where everyone was. But in the silence she could hear only her own breathing, quick and shallow, and she pressed a hand over her mouth to make it quieter. Footsteps moved slowly through the foyer. A man's voice spoke. He said, "There is another girl in the house. Find her." A flashlight swept across the living room ceiling. Delaney pressed her cheek against the cold wooden floor and looked through the gap beneath the sofa. And as the beam moved past, she saw a pair of shoes standing motionless in the foyer doorway, neither moving nor searching. She had seen those shoes every morning for 9 days, resting beside the leg of the wooden chair, next to a newspaper folded into quarters. The shoes turned away. They moved toward the kitchen, slowly and without hurry, and the flashlight beam followed them, and during the 3 seconds of complete darkness that came afterward, Delaney crawled. She dragged herself on her elbows and knees along the back of the sofa, across the glass scattered over the wooden floor, and something sliced into her forearm, but she didn't stop because she couldn't feel anything at all. When she reached the foot of the staircase, she stood and ran. She ran up to the 2nd floor in total darkness, counting the steps with her feet, 14 steps, because she had climbed and descended them for 9 days, and her body remembered the number. At the top of the hallway, she heard someone downstairs shout that the girl had gone up. At the end of the hallway was the door. Delaney struck her palm against the fingerprint reader mounted beside the frame. It lit up. That was the first thing she noticed, and for the first half-second she even felt relieved, because light meant the backup power was working, which meant the system was still running, which meant the door would open. She pressed her thumb against the glass. The light turned red. She wiped her finger against the hem of her shirt and tried again. Red. She switched to her index finger. Red. She pressed her entire hand against it, pushing hard, pushing until the joints in her fingers hurt. And that small glass panel kept turning red and going dark. Red and dark, and that red light was the only thing shining anywhere on the 2nd floor. "On your 2nd day here," he had said. "Your fingerprint has already been registered." Delaney stood with her back against the cold steel door, and in that moment she understood something whose feeling she would never forget. The system was still running. The backup power was still running. The door was functioning perfectly. Only she had been erased from it, today, sometime during that very day, by someone who knew the administrator password. This wasn't a malfunction. It was a signature. Footsteps were coming up the stairs. Delaney looked around the dark hallway, and there was nothing. No window that could be opened. No turn. Only 3 bedroom doors behind the men climbing toward her. She pressed herself into the corner at the end of the hallway, the darkest place she could find, and she stood there with both hands trembling violently, thinking with perfect clarity and perfect calm that she wasn't going to make it. The first flashlight beam swept across the ceiling. Then a man spoke from the staircase, his voice low and slow, the voice that had said the same sentence to her every morning for 9 days. "Good morning, Miss Cross. Stay downstairs. I'll go up," someone argued. Bruno repeated himself, no louder than before. "I'll go up." No one argued again, because 15 years beside Enzo Castellani meant something. Delaney listened to his heavy footsteps climb all 14 stairs, then stop at the entrance to the hallway. The flashlight came on and shone directly into her face. She raised a hand to shield her eyes. Bruno lowered the beam. In the light reflecting upward from the floor, Delaney saw his scarred face, and there was no triumph in it at all. He only looked exhausted. "You deleted my fingerprint," she said. "Yes." "You opened the door for them." "Yes." "Why?" Bruno didn't answer immediately. He glanced toward the staircase, where other footsteps were coming up behind him, then spoke 4 words, very quickly and very softly, just loud enough for her to hear. "They have my sister." Delaney couldn't speak. "She is in Providence," Bruno continued. "She is 51 years old. She teaches piano. She doesn't know what I do for a living. I haven't been able to reach her for 3 weeks. You could have told him. The boss would trade this entire city for her," Bruno said. "I couldn't allow myself to let that happen." 2 men reached the top of the stairs behind him. One of them asked where the girl was. Bruno didn't turn around. He took 2 steps forward, moving in such a way that his broad body filled the entire width of the narrow hallway, placing himself between Delaney and the 2 men behind him, a broad-shouldered man of 45 standing between a nurse and the flashlight beams. "Get down," he said without looking back. He said it to her very softly, almost gently. Then he raised his voice and spoke to the 2 men. "He told me to do this. He didn't tell you to touch her inside this house." The other man said something. Bruno answered with a short sentence Delaney couldn't make out. Then everything happened very quickly, and she was already pressed flat against the floor with both hands covering her head, just as he had told her. There was the sound of bodies colliding, of someone being thrown against the plaster wall, of a flashlight falling onto the carpet and rolling away, its beam sweeping across the hallway in circles as it turned. Light, darkness, light, darkness. There were 2 short shots. Then a heavy body fell to the floor about 1 meter from where she lay. Delaney lifted her head. Bruno was lying on his back on the hallway carpet, and he was still breathing, shallow and fast, and 7 years in the emergency room had taught her exactly what that kind of breathing meant. She crawled toward him. She placed both hands against his chest and pressed down, hard and in the right place, and she said, "Hold on, look at me, hold on," in the same voice she had used every night for 7 years. Bruno looked at her. He tried to say something. He managed 1 word, Providence, then another word she couldn't understand. Behind her, the second man was struggling up from the plaster wall and reaching for the gun that had fallen onto the carpet. Delaney didn't turn around. She kept pressing both hands down and didn't turn around, because turning would mean lifting her hands, and in 7 years, she had never lifted her hands from a chest that still needed them. She heard footsteps on the staircase. Very fast, 2 steps at a time, without any attempt at silence. Then there was 1 short shot behind her, and the man reaching for the gun on the carpet stopped reaching. Delaney raised her head. At the entrance to the hallway, beneath the beam of the flashlight lying loose on the carpet, Enzo Castellani stood there, breathing hard, his coat gone, and he was looking at her. He came down the hallway toward her slowly, and Delaney was still pressing both hands against Bruno's chest, so she couldn't stand. She could only lift her face and watch him approach. Enzo dropped to his knees in front of her. He raised both hands toward her face, then stopped halfway, leaving them suspended about 1 finger joint from her cheeks, hands covered in something that wasn't hers, trembling in the air, afraid to come any closer. "Are you hurt?" he asked. His voice was raw. "I'm fine. Your forearm is bleeding. It's only broken glass. You heard me, didn't you? It's only broken glass." He nodded. He nodded once, then nodded again, and the second movement was slower than the first, and his head never lifted completely. Delaney looked at him. She was still pressing both hands against Bruno's chest, and Enzo's men had flooded into the hallway behind them. Someone switched on the emergency lights, and the entire corridor turned a dull yellow, and in that light Delaney saw his face clearly for the first time. His lips were pale, not bloodless, only pale, the faint gray-blue shade a person recognized only after seeing it thousands of times. His forehead was wet. He was breathing through his mouth. "Give me your hand," she said. "Enzo," Give me your hand. He held it out, and Delaney removed one hand from Bruno's chest for exactly 1.5 seconds to grasp Enzo's wrist. His skin was cold. Not cold from an October night. Not cold from rain. Cold and damp, and beneath her fingers his pulse was fast and thin as a thread. "Where were you shot?" she said. "It's nothing. Where were you hit?" Enzo didn't answer. He looked down at Bruno and said something very softly to the man lying on the floor, in a language Delaney didn't understand, then leaned to one side, and when he moved, she saw the left side of his sweater, a large dark patch spreading from his waist downward, soaked all the way to the waistband of his trousers. And beneath the dull yellow light it didn't look red, it looked black. "How long have you been walking like this?" she asked. "Since I got out of the car. Enzo, how long?" "About 7 minutes," he replied. Delaney heard her voice change completely. It dropped lower, slowed down, lost every trace of trembling that remained, and became the voice 7 years in an emergency room had forged inside her, the voice that made an entire room full of strangers fall silent and obey. "Lie down, right now. Lie down with your head toward me." He did. She turned toward the nearest man, someone she had never seen before. "You, come here. Kneel right here. Put one hand over the other, and press straight down where my hands are. Press hard. Don't lift them no matter what happens." The man obeyed without asking a question. Delaney pulled her hands away from Bruno's chest and moved to Enzo. "You, pull his sweater up. Pull it. Higher." She looked. A small hole in his left side, low and close to the last rib, with the skin around it already gray. She slid one hand beneath his back and felt along both sides of his spine, but found nothing. There was no exit wound. The bullet was still inside him. She pulled off her own sweater, folded it twice, and pressed it down. She used both palms, driving her weight through her shoulders, and felt his body tense beneath her hands. "Has anyone called an ambulance?" she asked. "We can't," someone answered behind her. "There are 4 men down inside this house. Then get a car." Delaney didn't turn around. "Whoever has the keys, go start it right now. Don't take us to a private hospital. Don't take us to anyone's clinic. Go straight to St. Bridget's, the emergency department, the ambulance entrance at the back. I've worked there for 7 years. I know who is on duty tonight. If anyone asks, tell them it was a construction accident. Don't say anything else. Go." Footsteps raced down the stairs. "You too," she continued. "Carry this man down first. Use a blanket. Don't fold his body. Keep his chest flat. He is still breathing. Do you hear me? He is still breathing." They carried Bruno away. Only Delaney, Enzo, and one man holding a light remained in the hallway, and she kept both hands pressed against Enzo's side without lifting them. "Enzo," she said. "Look at me." He opened his eyes. She didn't know when he had closed them. "He told me," she said, speaking quickly and without stopping, because she knew how to keep someone conscious. "Bruno, he told me they were holding his sister in Providence. He didn't take money. Do you hear me? He didn't take a single cent." Enzo nodded. "Don't nod. Speak. Say it out loud. I heard you," he said. "Good. Keep talking. Say anything." He remained silent so long that Delaney pressed harder to force a reaction from him. Then he opened his mouth. 3 weeks ago," he said. "What?" 3 weeks ago. You had 12 minutes. Delaney felt something break inside her throat. "Be quiet," she said. "Be quiet and breathe." He didn't stop. He turned his head very slowly, until he could look directly at her, and she saw that his eyes were beginning to lose focus, his gaze drifting somewhere beyond her shoulder before pulling itself back. "My name," he said. "What?" "Ask me again. Ask me what my name is." Delaney bent closer. Her tears fell onto the backs of her own hands, and she couldn't wipe them away because both hands were occupied. "What is your name?" she asked. "Enzo," he replied. Then he closed his eyes. Delaney called his name once, then twice, and he didn't answer either time, and she never removed her hands from his body during the journey down all 14 stairs, through the drive across the bridge in the darkness, or while the tires climbed the concrete ramp toward the ambulance entrance behind St. Brigid's Hospital, a doorway she had passed through for 7 years and had never once crossed as a member of a patient's family. The doors flew open. White light crashed down over them. Someone shouted for his condition, and Delaney heard herself answer each word with perfect clarity. Male, 34 years old, penetrating wound to the left side with no exit wound, blood loss for approximately 70 minutes, falling blood pressure, rapid and weak pulse, continuous pressure maintained from the beginning. And this time, when they asked for the patient's name, she didn't have to write the words John Doe anywhere at all. The surgery lasted 5 hours. Delaney sat in the third-floor hallway, still wearing the ruined white shirt, both forearms bandaged by someone at some point she couldn't remember, and she sat in the exact plastic chair she had walked past thousands of times over 7 years without ever once sitting down. At 3 o'clock the following morning, they allowed her inside. Enzo lay slightly turned on his side, an intravenous line running into the back of his hand. His face still gray, but he was awake. "Bruno made it," she said. "They removed the bullet this afternoon. His sister arrived in Boston today. She wasn't hurt." Enzo closed his eyes for a long moment. "Send them out of the city," he said quietly. "Give Bruno enough to start over anywhere he wants. He protected you in that hallway when he didn't have to. We are even—" Delaney pulled the chair closer to the bed and sat down. "You said you would tell me?" she said. "Not that night. That was what you said." He opened his eyes and looked up at the ceiling. "The night of August 19th, he said. "My brother called me at 11:15. He told me someone was coming to the house in Wellesley. He told me not to call anyone, to drive there myself, because by then, he no longer trusted anyone in the house." Delaney said nothing. "It normally took 26 minutes to get there from where I was," Enzo said. "I did it in 22. I ran 4 red lights. I arrived at 11:37. He stopped. He drew in a breath, and Delaney watched his chest rise and fall very slowly beneath the blanket. 4 minutes too late, he said. She remained still. "I went into the garage and found him lying there, and I know it was 4 minutes because the camera in the garage recorded the time, and I've watched that footage more times than I can count during the past 3 years. At 11:33, he was still standing. At 11:37, I walked in. The picture Sloane showed you was of me pulling down the garage door. I lowered it because I didn't want anyone passing on the street to see my brother lying that way." "Who did it, Enzo?" Delaney asked softly. "Doyle's men," Enzo replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "They staged it to look like a heart attack, but I found the mark on his neck. For 3 years, I stayed silent because I couldn't prove it until I tore Doyle's empire apart piece by piece, and I would rather have let the family believe I was a ruthless villain than let Sloane know her father died betrayed by his own inner circle while her uncle was 4 minutes too late. People can live with a villain inside the family. No one can live with almost making it in time." Delaney sat without speaking for a very long time. Then she reached through the bed rail and threaded her fingers through his. "Do you remember the night 3 weeks ago?" she said. "The night they brought you in? The attending physician wanted to wait for more scans. I argued. I argued for 4 minutes. Then I shouted in the hallway. And in the end, they took you into surgery 12 minutes earlier than scheduled." She tightened her hand around his. "I've spent 7 years living with numbers like that," she said. 12 minutes, 4 minutes, 30 seconds. I know exactly what it feels like to stand between the two ends of a number like that. No one in this entire city understands what your 4 minutes mean, Enzo. But I do." He didn't answer. He only tightened his hand around hers, and they sat that way until morning. Cormac Doyle wasn't arrested. He collapsed the way men like him always collapsed. From the inside, quietly, in less than 2 months. First, word spread that a man at the top had to sit for 4 hours, 3 times a week, in a room in South Boston. Then came the fact that he had hidden it for 3 years, and in his world, the hiding carried more weight than the weakness. By January, the people who had once called him boss had divided everything among themselves and left. He sold the building in Charlestown, sold all 6 companies on the 4th floor, and the name Harbor Line disappeared from the state business registry. Delaney never used the other 3 copies of the paper. She burned them in the sink of her Dorchester apartment one afternoon while she was alone, and she never told anyone. Miriam Pruitt left the hospital after 5 weeks. The first thing she said when she was finally able to sit up was that the entire department should be ashamed for making her lie there so long. The second thing she said was to ask who had touched her locker. The third was to look at Delaney and say, "You've lost weight. I'm baking on Sunday. You're coming over to eat, and don't you dare make excuses." Sloane came to the hospital during the 2nd week. She listened to everything from beginning to end, and she cried for half an hour in the 3rd-floor hallway before entering the room and sitting beside her uncle's bed. And for the next 3 weeks she came every day. Some cracks could never heal into what they had once been. But people could still go on living inside a house with cracks, as long as no one pretended they weren't there. The following spring, a small clinic opened on the ground floor of an old building on Dorchester Street, exactly 200 meters from the bus stop. It charged nothing. 4 rooms, 6 employees, open from 8 o'clock in the morning until 8 o'clock at night. The sign outside carried 3 words: Wesley Cross Clinic. On Saturday morning, the waiting room was filled with children coming in for vaccinations. And on the reception desk sat a box of stickers Delaney had bought herself from an office supply store. All dinosaurs, in every color. A boy of about 7 sat waiting for his mother to finish signing the forms, his legs swinging without reaching the floor, a green dinosaur sticker pressed onto the back of his hand. "Miss, who was Wesley?" the boy asked. Delaney lowered herself until she was at eye level with him. "Wesley was my little brother," she said. "He was very good at drawing dinosaurs. He drew them on the covers of his math notebooks, his English notebooks, even on my notebooks. But he only drew plant-eating dinosaurs because he said they were gentler." "Where is he now?" the boy asked. She looked around the waiting room. She looked at the rows of children swinging their legs, at the box of stickers on the desk, at the sign beyond the glass door. "He is here," she said. The glass door opened at 10 o'clock. Enzo stepped inside, leaning on the wooden cane he still had to use, and still bitterly hated, carrying a square cardboard box in his other hand. He set the box of pastries on the reception desk. "Miriam sent these," he said. "She said that if you don't eat, she'll come down here herself." Delaney opened the lid, and the scent of cinnamon rose through the smell of antiseptic in the new clinic. He looked at her for a long time. "I won't promise you that my life will ever be peaceful," he said. "I can't promise that, but I can promise you one thing. From now on, wherever you are, whatever time it is, whatever happens, there will always be someone who knows where you are and comes looking for you. You will never disappear without anyone noticing again." Delaney stood behind the reception desk in a waiting room filled with the voices of children, and she smiled. "All right," she said. The story of Delaney Cross ended there, inside a small clinic on Dorchester Street, on a spring morning. Some people spend their whole lives saving others and forget that they, too, need someone to hold them back. Some debts can never be repaid with money, and can only be repaid by living with kindness every day. And sometimes the most precious thing one person can offer another isn't the promise of a peaceful life, but simply the promise that they will never allow the other person to disappear alone. If tonight's story touched you, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video so that every day you can discover more stories worth hearing. How did Delaney and Enzo's story make you feel? And what part of it stayed with you most? Please leave a comment below. We truly hope to hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. May you and your family always have abundant health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.